Hey there. So I had a lot of fun presenting the Crossroads spread, so much so that I decided to put off the video that I was planning on completing next in order to share another tarot spread with you. Because I'm kind of on a tarot kick and it seemed like the thing to do. Before starting, I just wanted to address a couple of things that you may be wondering. The first is that I'd gone through all the trouble of showing you my modifiable all-black tarot cards. And so you may be wondering why I'm not using those to present spreads. And although I'd be happy to, I kind of figured that this would be visually clearer if I used a published deck, the Rider-Waite in particular. It's something that's quite accessible, that a lot of you will be familiar with. The symbols on the black cards, while they're readily visible in person, are probably tough to pick up on film on YouTube, and you might have a really hard time engaging with the cards if, one, you can't make out what card they are, and also because having that imagery there sort of breaks up the doldrums of just solid black, because as you can tell, my palette is fairly monochromatic. So that is why I've decided to present these things using the Rider-Waite. If you would like for me to present something using my deck, the deck that I actually do my readings with for myself, just let me know. I'd be happy to do so and give you a sense of how I'm using the cards in practice. As we go through this, I will take the occasional pause for a sip because I am enjoying a lovely Cure Royale. It's probably a little early in the day to be doing champagne, but I don't know. Perhaps there's no such thing. So this tarot spread was really developed in order to explore inner archetypes. I call this spread the Internal Pantheon, and the idea of the spread is to capture the identities of those internal archetypes that are dictating the shape of your life right now, that are playing significant roles and coming to bear in a significant way on your personal identity, on your progress through life, in your practice. And it's quite a straightforward 8-card spread that is, of course, expandable. And as with the Crossroads spread, I will walk you through the positions first and then give you an interpretation so that you can see how this spread works in action. Although it's an 8-card spread, really there are 4 main positions. The key principal archetypes are these 2 cards at the top. The next 3 cards get turned over simultaneously. Then these cards at the sides. And then finally, a concluding card down here. So you're really reading this in 4 jolts. Now, of course, personal practice, you're allowed to flip over all the cards simultaneously if you so desire. For this particular spread, I think it benefits from doing it in phases, but it's entirely up to you. It's whatever works best. So as I mentioned, these top 2 cards are the 2 principal archetypes, the 2 main members of the Internal Pantheon. And here we have the Lovers and the Ace of Pentacles. These 2 main archetypes are the ones from which the other 3 archetypes, which are represented in the second row, spring, much as you would have a god and goddess, or any combination of gods, goddesses, fill in the blank, that produce offspring. The next 3 cards flow from the combined energies of these top 2 archetypes. So these 3 cards should really be read as if they are directly descended from these 2. So there will be aspects of these 2 energies, these 2 cards, that should influence and inform the reading of the next row. The next row, of course, is the secondary pantheon. And here we have the 6 of Cups, the 7 of Cups, and the Emperor. And so as the offspring of these top 2 cards, these are both a combination of the top 2, as I mentioned before, but they're also closer to your real life. They have more direct impact, more tangible identity and influence than these chief archetypes from which they flow. And although you're welcome to think of them as reflections of Jungian archetypes, id, ego, superego, I don't think you should feel moved to necessarily put them in those boxes if that doesn't make sense to you. To me, I see them as the triplet aspects of personality that are directly impinging on my world at the moment and the way I behave in that world. The things that are currently important to me, the things that shape the way I experience day-to-day life. So once you've got a handle on the identities involved in this pantheon, the next two cards really represent what decisions, what processes, what aspects of your life you should allow them to navigate. Because although this internal pantheon is really what's driving the car from behind the scenes, you're not necessarily allowing them to lead you where you need to be led. And these two cards represent where in your life you should let go of the direct reins and allow yourself to be guided by this pantheon that is at play. So you'll note that in the spread you could bisect it down the middle, and the cards are sort of arranged so that this process, this experience, this part of your life is more heavily ruled, should be allowed to be more heavily ruled by the identities on this side of the spread, whereas this card, these processes, these parts of your reality will benefit more from the input of this side of the spread. So this last position is about how best to allow this pantheon to manifest in your life. This final card is really a holistic representation of how, if you allow this pantheon to do so, they can guide you and what area of your life they will have the most influence on as a group, what lessons this pantheon can teach you if you let them. So one thing to note about the second position in this spread, or rather the third through fifth cards, is that, like all children, they bear greater or lesser resemblance to their parents. The card that is leftmost is most heavily influenced by the Lovers, whereas the Emperor will have been most heavily influenced by the Ace of Pentacles, and the Seven of Cups in between represents a more or less even split between the two parents. So the characteristics of the progeny reflect different ways in which those two key archetypes, those two key gods, goddesses, what have you, those internal aspects of self materialize in order to create other archetypes. Archetypes that are more readily accessible and that you may see in a more tangible manner in your day-to-day life. So as far as interpretation goes, we can begin with the two key archetypes. In this case, the Lovers and the Ace of Pentacles. So the Lovers here really, for me, encapsulate the concept of yearning, of desire, of longing to claim what you want, while simultaneously wanting to be able to give yourself up to something. Love need not represent a romantic entanglement between two people. This card can really represent desire, the things that drive us, the things we live for. The Ace of Pentacles is really raw, earthy potential. It is all of the energies of earth, unformed, as yet unguided, perhaps a bit counterintuitively because the pentacles or coins are generally associated with practical applications, material world. The Ace of Pentacles can also represent the more primordial, unshaped, wild energies, the primordial you, those things that haven't been impacted by considerations of materialism, or more directly, by the civilizing influence of the culture in which you exist. From these two top cards, the next three are born. So the Six of Cups is a manifestation of a desire to share, a desire to give and receive in turn. The idea that one's happiness can be built and expanded through the manner in which we interact and give to others. Shared joy, shared experience, the yearning for an innocent connection that is nevertheless deep and meaningful. On the far right, we have the Emperor, who's most influenced by the Ace of Pentacles, surprising exactly nobody watching this right now. So the Emperor is about staking position, taking space, claiming a role. He is practical and immovable, and yet this needn't reflect a desire for power's sake. The Emperor has goals, ambitions, his desires he seeks to achieve, dedication, earnestness, will to work can manifest those things that improve one's life and the lives of those around one. The Emperor's leadership claimed because that is how the task gets done. The Seven of Cups emerges from a more or less even blending of the Lovers and the Pentacle, whereas the Six of Cups is a card that reflects a desire to find joy with others, in others. The Seven of Cups is more about personal ambition and the challenge of choice, uncertainty regarding what exactly one wants. But these are wants and yearnings that do have a slightly selfish edge, wants that aren't necessarily always what's good for us, and yet that doesn't make them shameful or bad. It is a fundamental drive, and at times it serves us very well. The key is in knowing when that sort of desire has more to offer than simple satiation of acquisitiveness or power. The card also speaks to the knowledge that we're not yet fulfilled, and yet we don't know exactly how to fulfill ourselves. We may have some idea as to how it's achieved, but we can't know for certain yet. And although the options offered aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, there is a very tangible sense that we cannot in fact have them all. And so there's a very real danger that our uncertainty, our hesitation, will keep us from having any of them. I'd like to note at this point that this is the sort of spread that I wouldn't repeat for oneself very frequently. I feel like one really benefits from spending some time with the pantheon that you turn up. And in understanding this pantheon, it can serve you to rename the identities of each of these figures. And so the Lovers may become the yearner, to reflect the particular angle on which this card is being interpreted, that it doesn't necessarily or really speak at all to the idea of seeking romantic love, romantic fulfillment, but in meeting the desires of the heart that have thus far gone unsatiated. And I'd like to suggest that it might make sense for you to sit with each of those cards individually in order to get a feel for what personalities are really behind them in the context of this pantheon. So in terms of what sorts of aspects of one's life you would do best to allow that pantheon to influence. The Two of Swords, for instance, may represent a tendency to try and think logically through problems, to rely on rationality, when in fact you don't even know how to apply that knowledge, those thoughts, what you know, to solving the problem. And perhaps you're being called to give up that tendency specifically because those aren't the sorts of issues that can be dealt with logically. You may luck across a solution by thinking really hard and weighing the pros and cons, but ultimately by following the wisdom of your heart, your desires, what draws you, which in some cases may represent the only reliable hint with regards to what direction you should be moving. You find that not only do the solutions become clearer, but the questions themselves resolve into things you can understand and parse. Likewise, the Knight of Swords may represent a tendency that you have to rush forward with whatever plan occurs to you first. In a desire to solve problems, you find that instead of driving your intention begins to drive you. And you're essentially just crossing your fingers in the hope your cleverness will win the day. But the Ace of Pentacles, the Emperor, and even the Seven of Cups speak to a need to ground yourself, to consider your options, to know what direction you actually ought to be running in before you take off at full speed. And that even if you're bright enough to think of a solution, you perhaps need to recognize that taking one's time isn't a vice, and that taking a more considerate, stead approach will provide your life with some much-needed stability. Desires and instinct filtered through a calm and steady being like the Emperor allows you to build upon those desires on a solid foundation. Lastly, how the pantheon as a whole would come to manifest. What, if allowed to do so, they would guide you toward. And here we have the card Judgment, which, for instance, may be taken to represent the sort of transformative deliverance that comes from understanding what really drives you, what it is your rashness or your clever thinking is trying to win, those deep yearnings that dictate what you put your mind to and why you run towards it so quickly. I hope you enjoyed this. I also hope that the video doesn't end up cropping off the top chunks of the cards like the last one. I'm still trying to figure out this iMovie software. As always, I welcome your opinions, suggestions, thoughts in the comments, and I look forward to next time. Have a great day. Oh, last thing. Yes, I'm finished.